Okay, welcome back, class. This is Unit 2, Research. This is the second part of methods. We've looked at case study, survey, and naturalistic observation. We now are going to get into correlation. And first thing you need to know is correlation is one where researchers try to show the relationship or correlation between two variables. So they're finding the relationship between these two. Sitting in the front, maybe one, and you notice that more students get a better grade. If sitting in the back, students get a maybe lower grade. You're looking at these two variables. You're trying to make a relationship between these two and making it for the purpose of prediction. Some things to consider. It is important to remember that correlation does not necessarily mean cause. So positive, you're linking the two items together, but negative, it doesn't prove anything. Correlations have a correlation coefficient. Correlation coefficient is a number between -1 and +1, expressing the degree of the relationship between the two variables. How closely these two things are related, okay, can tell you how strong the correlation may be. Okay, closer to 0 shows a weaker correlation. So here's your line here. Okay, closer to 0, either direction, the weaker the correlation. Okay, so I gave you, if we were looking at a positive correlation, I gave you, let's say, 0.8 and 0.25. Which one would have a stronger correlation? Well, 0.8, because it's closer to 1. Works the same way for the other side, closer to -1. So if I gave you -0.4 and -0.75, which one is stronger? The -0.75, because it's closer to 1. Okay. They do plot correlations out on a scatter plot. They track the two variables on a chart. The clusters of dots represent the value of the two variables. So they may be looking at the longer you're married, maybe the more you weigh. The slope of the point suggests a relationship. Either both rising or both falling are going to be a positive correlation. Okay. One rising and one falling is going to be a negative correlation. Okay, so you have this one maybe particularly rising in one direction and then maybe falling in a certain direction. Okay. Little scatter shows a stronger correlation. So this one is going to be a really strong correlation because there's not a lot of scatter versus this correlation. All right. Make sure you understand positive correlation. Positive correlations are both going in the same direction. It doesn't matter if they're both rising or both falling. They're both going in the same direction. So it's also known as direct correlation. If the correlation coefficient is a positive number, there's a positive correlation between them. Both variables rise or fall together. The more you eat, I always lift my hand up in one direction, the greater you weigh. Both are going up. The less you eat, the less you weigh. Okay? The longer you're married, the similar political views. The less you're married, less of the same political views. The older you are, the more money you have. It works the other way. The younger you are, the less money you have. Both moving in the same direction. And moving on to negative correlation, inverse. If the correlation coefficient is a negative number, there is a negative correlation between the variables. One variable goes up and the other goes down. So the longer one smokes, that's going up. The shorter their life, that's going down. Okay. The older they are, one's going up. The less hair they have, going down. Okay. One's going up and the other is going the opposite. If the correlation coefficient is 0, there's little correlation between the variables. Okay. Illusory correlation, there's an illusion that took place. The perception that a relationship exists when in reality it doesn't. They're just random coincidences. Okay, so here the textbook gave adoption. A Most people think the minute somebody adopts, the more prone they are to now all of a sudden having a kid. There's a lot of people out there that adopt and never have kids, but we just probably don't make awareness to it, because it doesn't maybe spark our interest. You don't maybe sit back and think about it. But cases that do all of a sudden conceive right away, we hear about them, and so people think that there's a correlation between them, and there's not. There's kind of like the illusion. The next method is experiments. Experiments is the kind of research in which researchers control and manipulate the variables. You're trying to prove a cause, help to identify cause in effect of a situation. This is the only method to prove the cause. Circle it, highlight it, star it. Only one to prove cause. Alright? They do decide on random assignment when selecting participants. Different from random sampling. Random sampling remembers them in surveys. Random assignment is when you select, hey, I'm going to have this group of people be in this group and this group of people be in this group. And the two groups are experimental and control groups. So random assignment is assigning participants to either the experimental or the control group by chance. Alright, so it's just a chance. So now we were talking about the groups before. You could have an experimental and control group. Okay, the experimental group is the group that's getting manipulated, and the control group is the group that's staying the same. So my experiment I'm setting up is, does caffeine allow you to remember more terms? So I'm going to give my period 1 the caffeine. I'm going to teach them a list of terms, and then I'm going to give them a memory test. I'm also going to run this a similar situation, period 10, but I'm not going to give them the caffeine. I'm just going to teach them, and then I'm going to see how many terms they remember. My experimental group is the group that's changing, manipulated. For my period 1, they're getting coffee. Control, staying the same, they're not. Alright. The independent variable and dependent variable is what's happening, what are you giving them, and what's happening particularly with the behavior. So the independent variable is the stimulus. So I'm giving them coffee to some groups. The dependent variable is the response, what's going to happen. So I remember if you do the independent variable, then the dependent variable is going to happen. So if I give coffee, then how many terms you're going to remember. So the independent here would be the coffee. The dependent variable would be the results of the task. Make sure you know the difference between control and independence. These are terms students usually mix up. Okay? And yes, there's other confounding variables in my study. Confounding variables have an unwanted influence on the outcome of the experiment. Okay? So yes, one's period 1, one's period 10. Maybe my period 10 students had caffeine at lunch. Maybe my period 1 students also had another extra cup of coffee. And maybe I just have students in period 1 that can remember things better. Okay? There's a lot of confounding variables that can influence it. Double-blind procedure would be me, the researcher running the experiment. I wouldn't know which student got the coffee, because maybe I used a placebo. Okay? The placebos are often given because if they don't have a placebo, sometimes the students who are getting the coffee versus kids that aren't getting the coffee might act differently because they know they're part of this experiment. Alright, so a placebo uses manipulative ways to distort the perception thinking about one may have thinking about an experiment. Experimental research, why it's good. Okay, researchers have precise control over the variables and also prove cause. Disadvantages, you gotta consider the ethics. Okay, you have to make sure you practice limitations. Sometimes you're setting up an artificial environment. There may be a researcher's bias towards a certain situation. And then obviously all the confounding variables and stuff. Okay, so when you're doing research, you do need to consider the ethics of research, and this is pointed out in the textbook. Each university or group doing research must have the Institutional Review Board, which is responsible for making sure research is performed in an ethical manner. APA sets guidelines, the American Psychological Association, that most people must follow, or all people must follow. At the end of methods, correlation, and experiments, I will see you in class on Monday. And